There is a house on a narrow street in the old heart of Vienna, and the people who live around it have learned not to look at the upper windows after dark. They don't discuss why. If you press them directly, they'll shrug, mention the damp or the draft that comes off the river in winter, or comment on the way old buildings settle and groan, and then they'll swiftly change the subject, the way people do when the true answer is one they've decided long ago not to speak aloud. But I'm going to speak it aloud tonight, because this story was once written down by a man who had every reason to keep it quiet, and then it was buried in the back of a parish record for more than 100 years, and almost nobody ever read it again. I read it, and I've spent a long time deciding whether to tell it. So, before we go any further, let me ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever room you're sitting in, I want you to think about the last time a house felt wrong to you. Not haunted, not scary, just wrong in a way you couldn't name. A room you didn't want to turn your back on. Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and I'm always struck by how many people have one of those rooms in their past. And a note before this one begins. If what you're about to hear is the kind of story you'd want more of, I've put 10 of them into an audiobook. It's called The Hollow Files. 5 hours, 10 cases, the same voice you're listening to right now. Each one pulled out of a record someone tried to forget. You'll find the link down in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments, so it's the first thing you see. Go look when this is over. Now then, the story. It begins in the autumn of 1888 in the 2nd district of Vienna, in a tall grey house that belonged to a man named Walburga Senheim. Senheim was a maker of clocks, not the cheap kind you'd find in a shop window, but the slow, intricate kind that wealthy families ordered and then waited 2 years to receive. He was 53, and he had spent most of those years bent over tiny brass wheels with a glass screwed into one eye, and the work had bent him too, so that even when he stood up straight, he looked like he was leaning toward something only he could see. He was not a warm man. The people who knew him used the word correct. He paid his debts on the day they were due. He went to church and sat in the same pew and never sang. And he had married late, a woman named Walburga, who was younger than him by 15 years and whom nobody in the district ever quite seemed to know. Walburga Senheim was 48 that autumn. People who saw her on the street described a tall, narrow woman with very pale eyes and dark hair. She wore pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She kept the house. She did not have friends in the ordinary sense. No women who came for coffee, no cousins who visited. She had a housekeeper, an older woman called Apollonia Dreschka, who came in the mornings and left before dark, and who would much later be the one to start telling people what she had seen. For most of their marriage, nothing about the Senheims was worth a second glance. A quiet clockmaker and his quiet wife in a quiet house full of ticking. And then, in the 2nd week of October, Walburga Senheim died. He died in his workshop at his bench in the middle of the afternoon, with a half-finished mechanism in front of him and the tools still warm in his hands. The doctor, who was called a physician named Augustin Riedmeier, found nothing obviously wrong. The heart, he wrote in the careful language of the time, a failure of the heart. Senheim was 53. He worked too hard. He ate too little. And one afternoon his heart simply stopped while he was setting a gear no larger than a fingernail. That should have been the end of it. A sad, ordinary death and a widow in black and a house to be sold. But here is the first strange thing, and Riedmeier noted it himself in a letter he wrote much later, because it troubled him even then. When Walburga Senheim died, every clock in the house stopped. Not gradually, not over the following days as the springs wound down. All of them at once, at the same minute. The long-case clocks in the hall, and the carriage clocks on the mantels, and the dozens of unfinished pieces in the workshop, and the small gold watch in the dead man's own waistcoat pocket. Riedmeier checked that last one himself by reflex, the way a doctor checks a watch against a pulse. It had stopped at 20, 3 minutes past 3. He held it to his ear. Nothing. He shook it gently. Nothing. He wound it, and the hands moved under his thumb, and the moment he let go, it stopped again. Every clock in that house had stopped at 23 minutes past 3, and not one of them would run again. Reed Mayer told himself there was an explanation. A change in temperature, perhaps, some draft, some shift in the old building. He was a man of science, and the year was 1888, and science was busy explaining everything that century, one thing after another. And he had no patience for the kind of talk you heard from old women in the markets. So he wrote, "Heart failure." And he signed the certificate, and he went home. He did not think about the house again for 11 days. On the 12th day, Apollonia Dreshka came to his door at 6 in the morning, out of breath, having walked the whole way because she didn't trust herself to wait for a cab. And she told him that something was wrong with the widow, and that he had to come at once, and that she would not, under any circumstances, go back into that house alone. Now, I want you to picture this woman. Apollonia Dreshka was 55 years old. She had worked in that house for 9 years. She had buried 2 employers before Senheim, and she was not a nervous person. Not the kind who saw faces in the curtains. Riedmayer knew her a little, and he trusted her judgment. And the thing that frightened him before he even reached the house was simply the look on her face, the way her hands wouldn't stay still. She told him, on the walk over, what had been happening. It had started small. In the days right after the funeral, the widow had seemed only grief-struck, which was natural. She stopped eating much. She sat in her husband's workshop for hours among all those stopped clocks, doing nothing. Apollonia would bring her broth and find it untouched, cold. A skin formed on the top of it. Then the widow stopped sleeping in her own bed. She moved instead into a small chair in the corner of the bedroom facing the door, and she sat there through the night with her eyes opened. When Apollonia arrived in the morning, she would find her exactly there, in the same position, as though she hadn't moved in hours. And the room, Apollonia said, was always cold, colder than the rest of the house, cold enough that her own breath showed even with a fire laid in the grate. And then there was the matter of the voice. Walburga Senheim had always been a soft-spoken woman, a quiet voice, a Viennese accent, nothing remarkable. But in the second week, Apollonia began to hear her talking in the bedroom when there was no one else in the house. Long, low conversations going on for an hour at a time. And the trouble was not that the widow was talking to herself, because grief does that to people, and Apollonia knew it. The trouble was that sometimes the voice that answered was not the widow's. It was lower. It was a man's voice, and it came from the same room, behind the same door, when Apollonia knew it. Because she had counted the people in that house every single day for 9 years, that there was no man inside it. That was the morning she walked to the doctor's house. Riedmayer listened to all of this, and I'd like to tell you that he was a brave and open-minded man who took it seriously at once, but he didn't. He thought privately that the widow was suffering from a disorder of the nerves brought on by grief and by sitting alone in a cold house full of stop clocks. He had a word for it, a respectable medical word, and the word let him feel calm. He brought his bag. He thought he might prescribe rest and quiet, and perhaps a stay in the country. He was thinking about the country when Apollonia unlocked the front door, and the cold came out to meet them. You know that feeling, I think, when you open a door and the air on the other side is wrong, not just cold, but still. The kind of stillness that has weight to it, that presses against your face. Riedmayer felt it the moment the door swung in, and he was a doctor. He'd been in plenty of rooms with the dead in them, and this was not that. This was something he had no name for, and the not having a name was the worst part. The house was silent. Not one clock ticked. He had forgotten in 11 days how strange that was. A clockmaker's house with no sound in it at all, and now it came back to him with force. The hall was full of long-case clocks, Beautiful old things with brass faces, and every one of them was stopped, and every one of them he saw as he passed. Read 23 minutes past 3. They went up the stairs. The bedroom door was at the end of the landing, and it was shut. And from behind it came the sound of a woman talking, very quietly, very steadily. The words too low to make out. Apollonia stopped at the top of the stairs and would come no further. Riedmeier told her to wait. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the latch, and the latch was so cold it almost hurt to hold. Cold the way iron is cold in deep winter, and the year was only barely into autumn. He opened the door. Walburga Senheim was sitting in the chair in the corner, exactly as Apollonia had described, facing the door, her hands folded in her lap. She was perfectly still, and when the door opened and the doctor stepped in, she turned her head toward him slowly, and she smiled, and she said, in her own ordinary soft voice, "Dr. Riedmeier, he said you would come back." Riedmeier asked her who had said that, and Walburga Senheim kept smiling and she didn't answer, and the room was so cold that the water in the washstand basin had a thin grey film of ice across the top of it. I'm going to pause the story here for just a moment, because I want to be honest with you about something. When I first read the account this comes from, I assumed I knew where it was going. A grieving widow, a cold room, a voice in the dark. I thought I'd read this story before 100 times. I thought I knew the shape of it. I was wrong about the shape of it. I want to be careful how I tell you the rest, because the truth of what was in that house is stranger and quieter than the story I expected. And it took me a long time to understand it. And a breath here before we go on. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection of these called the Hollow Files, 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet, patient trouble I'm telling you about right now. Each one taken from a record that someone meant to bury. The link is in the description below, and it's pinned at the very top of the comments. If you're enjoying this, do me a favor and subscribe before you go so the next one finds you. And if you happen to be hearing this somewhere that isn't the channel it came from, then someone has taken it without asking, and I'd be grateful if you'd let us know. Now, back to the bedroom. Riedmeier did what a doctor does. He approached her. He took her wrist to feel her pulse, and her skin was cold, colder than a living person's skin should be, and her pulse, when he found it, was slow, far too slow, 30 beats to the minute, then fewer. The kind of pulse you find in a body that's failing, except that she was sitting upright and looking at him and speaking in complete sentences. He asked her how she was sleeping. She said she didn't sleep anymore. She said there was no need. He asked her if she'd been eating. She said food had stopped having a taste, and so she'd stopped bothering with it. She said this calmly, the way you'd mentioned that it had rained. And then, while he was still holding her wrist, she leaned forward slightly, and she said something that he wrote down that same night, word for word, because he could not get it out of his head. She said, "You signed the paper, doctor. Failure of the heart, but you didn't ask whose heart or what it failed to do." Riedmeier told her he didn't understand, and Walburga Senheim turned her pale eyes on him, and she said, "My husband made an arrangement a long time ago, before I knew him, and the arrangement came due, and he tried to refuse it at the end, and that is why his heart stopped at 23 minutes past 3, because that was the hour the bill was called." She paused. "It is still here, doctor. It did not get what it came for, so it is waiting. Now, you and I sitting here, we can call that the talk of a woman whose mind has come apart under grief, and Riedmeier wanted badly to call it that. But there were the clocks, and there was the cold, and there was the small detail that he had never told a living soul the exact minute on his own watch, 23 minutes past 3, and yet she had just said it back to him. He left the house that day deeply shaken, and he did the thing that a careful man does when he's frightened and won't admit it. He went looking for facts. He told himself he was building a medical history. What he was really doing was trying to find solid ground under a story that had started to tilt. He found Walburga Senheim's lawyer, an elderly man named Casimir Woolwinkel, who had handled the Clockmaker's affairs for 30 years. And Woolwinkel, once he understood that Senheim was dead, became very quiet, and then he said something that Walburga hadn't expected. He said, "Did you find the box?" Walburga asked, "What box?" Woolwinkel said that Senheim had come to him many years before, a young man then, just starting out, and had given him a sealed wooden box with instructions that it was to be opened only after his death and only by his widow, if he had one. Woolwinkel had kept it in his strong room for 30 years and never once been tempted to look inside, because there had been something in the way Senheim spoke about it that made him not want to. He told me, Woolwinkel said, that the box held the price of everything he had, his skill, his shop, the marriage even, when it came. He said he'd paid for all of it at once when he was young and had nothing, and that the box was the receipt. The old lawyer looked at his hands. I took it for a figure of speech, a man who'd worked his way up talking about what it cost him. I didn't think he meant it the way I'm beginning to think he meant it. The box, Woolwinkel said, had been collected 3 weeks earlier by Senheim himself, just before he died. So somewhere in that grey house, there was a 30-year-old sealed box that a clockmaker had described as the receipt for his soul, and he had retrieved it from his lawyer days before his heart stopped at 23 minutes past 3. I want you to sit with the timing of that for a second. He went and got it, he brought it home, and then he died. Walburga went back to the house, and this time he brought someone with him. He'd realized by then that the problem in front of him was not a medical one, or not only a medical one, and that he was out of his depth, and that he needed a man whose whole life was the study of things that doctors don't talk about. So, he went to the parish church, and he found an old priest named Celestin Marquardt, who was 61 and half deaf and famous in the district for being the only clergyman who didn't laugh at people when they came to him afraid. Father Celestin listened to the entire story without saying a word, and when Walburga finished, the old priest didn't make the comforting noises Walburga was hoping for. He didn't say it was nerves or grief or imagination. He sat for a long time and then he said, "Tell me again about the clocks." Walburga told him again. The stopping, the hour, the way they wouldn't run. And Father Celestin said, "When a man makes a bargain like the one you're describing, the old accounts say there's always a price and always a term, a set length of time, and always a way the debtor tries to cheat at the end. Some hide, some run, some try to find another to take their place." He looked up. A clockmaker would think in time, wouldn't he? A clockmaker's whole craft is the measuring of time. If a man like that wanted to cheat a debt that came due at a certain hour, what do you think he'd try? Walburga understood it slowly, and when he understood it, the back of his neck went cold. He'd try to stop the hour from arriving. He'd try to freeze the clocks. Every timepiece in that house had stopped at 23 minutes past 3 the moment the debt was called. And a younger man might have called it a coincidence, but Father Celestin called it the last desperate trick of a dying clockmaker. Senheim had tried in the final seconds of his life to stop time itself, to hold the house at the minute before the bill came due forever, so that the thing that had come to collect could never quite arrive. And it had half worked. That was the terrible part. The clocks had stopped. Time in that house had snagged on a single minute like cloth on a nail. But the thing that had come to collect was still inside, in the cold, waiting for the minute to pass, and it could not pass because the dead clockmaker had jammed it. And in the meantime, the thing had found something else to occupy itself with. It had found the widow. The two men went up to the bedroom together. Apollonia Dreschka would not enter the house any more. So it was just the doctor and the old priest climbing those stairs into the cold. And the cold was worse now, far worse, their breath hanging in front of them in clouds. frost forming on the inside of the windows even though it was a mild October day on the street below. Walburga was in the chair. She had not moved. Riedmeier was no longer sure she ever moved. And when Father Celestin came through the door, she turned her head and she looked at him, and she said in that low voice that was not hers, the man's voice, the one Apollonia had heard, "You're late, Father. We've been waiting 30 years for someone to read the contract. He never let anyone read it. Wouldn't you like to read it?" And she lifted one hand and pointed with one pale finger at the wall beside the bed. There was a wooden box on the floor there, old, dark, the seal broken, the box from the lawyer's strongroom. And spread out on the floor beside it, where someone had laid it open, was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and folded into hard creases, covered in writing. Father Celestin did not move toward it. He had been a priest for almost 40 years, and he knew the oldest rule of his trade, which is that you do not pick up the thing that is being offered to you so eagerly. He kept his eyes on the woman, and he began very quietly to pray. Not loudly, not the dramatic way you might imagine, just a low, steady murmur, the same words over and over, the way you'd talk to calm a frightened animal. And the temperature in the room dropped so fast that the water in the basin, which had been filmed with ice before, cracked clean across with a sound like a snapped bone. The voice coming out of Walburga stopped being patient. It said, "I won't tell you everything." Some of it was in a language Father Celestin didn't recognize, and some of it was in plain German, and the plain German was worse because it knew things. It knew about the doctor's dead sister. It knew about the night the priest had nearly left the church 40 years ago, and why. It said these things in the widow's soft voice, and then in the man's low voice, switching back and forth. And the whole time her face stayed perfectly still and pleasant, like a person listening to music. Father Celestin kept praying, and here is the thing that he wrote down afterward, the detail that he said he would never forget as long as he lived. The voice was not trying to hurt them. It was trying to make a deal. It offered the doctor his sister back. It offered the priest his lost certainty, the faith he'd been quietly missing for 40 years. It offered over and over in that reasonable tone to give each of them the one thing they wanted most. And all they had to do in return was the smallest thing, the simplest thing. Pick up the paper, read it aloud, sign beneath the name that was already there. Because that Father Celestin realized was the trick. That was the way out the Clockmaker had been looking for and never found. The debt could be passed on. If another living soul read the contract willingly and put their name to it, the term would reset. The clocks would start again. The minute would pass, and the thing would take its long, overdue payment and go, leaving the house quiet and a new debtor in Senheim's place. The widow had not signed it. In 30 years of marriage, she had never even known the box existed. She was not a debtor. She was only the nearest living person when the bill came due, and the debtor died trying to dodge it. The thing had taken up residence in her the way water takes the shape of whatever it's poured into, because she was there and warm and alive, and it had to wait somewhere while it looked for a way to be paid. And now it had 2 more warm bodies in the room and a paper on the floor. And all it needed was for one of them to be tired enough or grieving enough or afraid enough to reach down and pick it up. Riedmeier wrote that he came very close. He was a young man and his sister had died 2 winters before. And the voice described her so exactly. The sound of her laugh, the gap between her front teeth, the way she said his name, that he found himself, without deciding to, taking a step toward the paper on the floor. It was Father Celestin who stopped him. The old priest didn't shout. He simply put one hand flat against the doctor's chest, not pushing, just resting it there. And he said quietly, not to the doctor and not to the thing, but to the room in general, whatever it gives you with her hands. Look at her hands. And Riedmeier looked at the widow's hands. They were folded in her lap the way they had been the whole time. But while he watched, They began very slowly to move, to turn at the wrist in a way that wrists are not built to turn, to open and flex with too many small movements, like something testing out a glove it had only just put on and didn't yet know how to wear. That was what broke the spell on him. Not fear exactly, but pity. The understanding that the woman in the chair was still in there, somewhere behind those pale eyes, and that everything the voice offered, it offered while wearing her like a coat, and that to take the deal would be to leave her in it forever. He stepped back from the paper. I've thought a lot about that moment, about the fact that what saved him wasn't faith, and it wasn't courage, and it wasn't some holy weapon. It was him looking at a suffering person and refusing to buy his own comfort with her ruin. There's something in that I keep turning over. Have you ever been offered exactly the thing you wanted most at exactly the moment you were weak enough to take it and known, somewhere underneath, that the price was someone else? If you have, you'll understand the doctor. Tell me about it down in the comments. I mean that. The ones who write to me about that kind of moment always seem to be the ones who turned it down, and I've never decided whether that's because the takers don't watch stories like this or because they don't survive them. So, Father Celestin had understood the rules by then, and he understood that he could not win this by force, because there was nothing in the room to fight. You cannot wrestle a debt. You cannot pray a contract out of existence. The thing had a legal hold in whatever court these things are settled because a clockmaker had signed in his own hand 30 years before and taken everything he was promised and lived a long, comfortable life on it. The debt was real, the debt was owed. But the debt was owed by Walburga Senheim, not by his widow, not by the doctor, not by the priest. And Walburga Senheim was dead. That was the flaw, and Father Celestin found it. He stopped trying to drive the thing out of the woman. Instead, he spoke to it directly, in plain words, the way the old lawyer Woolwinkle might have spoken across a desk. He said the debtor was dead. He said the debtor had tried to cheat the term by stopping the clocks and had failed and had died in the attempt, and that the thing's quarrel was with him and him alone. He said the widow had never signed, never agreed, never even known, and could not be held to a paper she had never seen. He said, and this is the part that Mayer underlined 3 times in his account, that a debt cannot be collected twice, and that the moment the clockmaker died in the act of refusing payment, the price had been taken. The price had been the clockmaker's own life, surrendered in fear rather than handed over in fulfillment. The account, the priest argued, was closed. Badly closed, angrily closed, but closed. There was no one left in that room who owed anything. He was bluffing. He told Mayer afterward that he had no idea whether any of it was true. He had made it up out of 40 years of funerals and a lifetime of listening to people argue about who owed what. But he said it the way you have to say these things, with no doubt in your voice at all, because the one thing he was certain of was that the thing in the room ran on agreements, on terms, and on language, and that if there was any way to send it off, it would be through words correctly placed, spoken with authority. And the room got colder still, so cold that ice spread across the inside of the window in feathers while they watched. And the widow's mouth opened, and the man's voice came out of it, and it said one word. It said, "Prove it." So Father Celestin walked slowly to the box on the floor, and he did not pick up the contract. He picked up the box itself, the empty wooden box, and he turned it over. And on the underside, burned into the wood, was the same date in the same hand that began the contract, the day Senheim had signed. And the priest read out the term written beneath it, 30 years. The bargain had a term of 30 years. And then he asked the doctor for the dead man's watch, the gold one, the one that had stopped in his waistcoat pocket at 23 minutes past 3. Mayer had kept it. He'd never been able to explain to himself why he'd taken it, except that it had felt wrong to leave it in the house. Father Celestin held the watch up, and he said that the term had run, that 30 years had passed to the day, that the clockmaker had been given his 30 years exactly, lived every one of them, and that the thing standing in the room demanding payment was not owed a future debt, but was squabbling over a bill that the debtor's own death had already settled. He said it was no longer collecting, it was loitering, and that there is no law in any court, in any world, that lets a creditor stay in a house after the debt is paid simply because it doesn't like how the payment was made. He wound the watch. Riedmeier said the sound of that little gold watch beginning to tick in that frozen, silent room was the loudest thing he had ever heard. It ticked once, it ticked twice, and then all through the house the clocks began to run, all of them at once. The long-case clocks in the hall, and the carriage clocks on the mantels, and the dozens of unfinished pieces in the workshop. Every brass wheel that Walburga Senheim had ever set. All of them shuddered and began to move. And the minute that had been frozen for 3 weeks finally turned over. 23 minutes past 3 became 20, 4 minutes past 3. The minute passed. And the thing that had been waiting for the minute to pass got at last exactly what it had come for. And what it had come for was a debtor who had died in the act of refusing to pay. Which is to say it got nothing it could use. An empty payment. A closed account. A corpse 3 weeks in the ground. The cold went out of the room all at once, like a held breath let go. And Walburga Senheim slumped forward in her chair and gasped. The long, ragged gasp of someone surfacing from underwater, and began for the first time since her husband died to weep. Ordinary tears. Warm moan. Now I told you at the start that the truth of this was stranger and quieter than the story I expected. And here is what I meant. She lived. Walburga Senheim recovered. It took months. She was thin as a reed and her hair had gone white at the temples, and she never spoke about those 3 weeks except once. And that was years later, and I'll come to it, but she recovered. She sold the house and the workshop and every clock in it, and she moved across the city to a small set of rooms near the church where Father Celestin served. And she lived another 19 years quietly, kindly. By all accounts a gentle and patient woman who was good to the people around her and who never once in all that time kept a clock in her home. Not one. She told her landlady she couldn't stand the sound of them. Riedmeier stayed her doctor until the end. He wrote that she was the sanest person he ever knew, and that the only mark the experience left on her, the only one he could ever find, was that she could not bear to be in a still, cold, silent room and would always, the moment she entered anywhere, open a window or light a fire or start some small ordinary noise. A kettle. A clock she immediately regretted and gave away. Anything just so that the silence couldn't settle. Because she remembered the silence. She remembered 3 weeks of it. And she said, the one time she ever spoke of it, near the end of her life, that the worst part had never been the cold or the voice or the offers it made. The worst part was that for 3 weeks she had been awake the entire time behind her own eyes, watching her own hands move wrong, hearing it speak with her mouth, aware of everything and unable to make a single sound that was her own. And that the thing had known she was in there and had liked it, and had taken its time precisely, because it knew she could feel every minute of the wait. She said the only thing that had kept her from going truly and finally mad in all those frozen hours was a sound she could just barely hear far away underneath everything. A small, faint, stubborn ticking, one gold watch in a dead man's pocket that wouldn't quite stop. She didn't know whose it was. She didn't know what it meant. She only knew that as long as she could hear it somewhere, something in that house was still keeping time, still counting, still moving toward whatever came next. And that meant the frozen minute couldn't last forever. And that meant there might someday be a 24th minute past 3 and a way out. She held on to a ticking she couldn't see for 3 weeks, and she was right to. And that's the story, more or less. The widow lived. The doctor kept her secret and his own. The old priest died a few years later peacefully in his sleep with His housekeeper said, a small, contented smile, and no one ever asked what he was smiling about. The house was sold and resold and split into apartments and stands there still on its narrow street in the old part of Vienna. And the people who live around it have learned over the long, slow years, without ever quite knowing why, not to look at the upper windows after dark. I said I'd be honest with you, so here's the part I can't explain and the reason I finally decided to tell this one. When Riedmeyer's account was found tucked into the back of a parish record more than 100 years later, there was a note added to the bottom of the last page. It was not in his handwriting. It was in a much older, much more careful hand. The hand of a man who'd spent his life writing tiny, precise letters next to tiny brass wheels. And all it said was this: 30 years was the term. She had 19 left when I stopped the clocks. I did not stop them to save myself. I stopped them so she would have time. Tell her, if you ever can, that I am sorry and that I counted every minute I bought her and that it was the only honest thing I ever made. It was signed with a single initial, and underneath the signature, pressed into the old paper, faint but unmistakable, was the small, round mark of a watch case, as though someone had set a gold pocket watch down on the page, just for a moment while they wrote. I don't know what to do with that. I've turned it over for a long time. A man who sold everything he was decades before he ever met her, and then spent his last living seconds trying to buy her a little more time with the only craft he had. I can't tell you if that makes him a good man. I'm not sure it makes him anything that's simple. But I think about him stopping all those clocks at the exact instant his heart gave out, jamming the whole house at 1 minute so the thing chasing him couldn't quite reach her, and dying that way on purpose at his bench with the gears still warm in his hands. And I think about the ticking she heard underneath the silence for 3 weeks. The one sound that wasn't the thing. The one thing in that house that was still on her side. So, that's where I'll leave it. If you knew this voice was one you'd want more of, I've put 10 more like it into the hollow files, 5 hours, 10 cases. Every one of them pulled out of a record somebody tried to forget and told the same way I told you this one. The link's in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Go and find it. And before you go, do the small thing. Subscribe so the next story finds you on its own. Leave a comment and tell me about the room you didn't want to turn your back on, or the offer you turned down because the price was someone else. I read them. They're how I find the next one. And the next time you're somewhere very quiet, somewhere very still, and you notice that you haven't heard a single sound in longer than feels right, do what she did. Listen underneath the silence. See if anything's still keeping time. Because as long as something is, you've got a minute left. And a minute, it turns out, can be everything. Sleep well.